All right, we got it.
No sound.
No sound. We're good.
Okay.
All right.
No one but Daniel talking.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking about consciousness and whether or not quantum mechanics has a place in explaining this. I'm glad we had that other presentation on quantum mysticism before. This is going to be controversial. I'm just going to say that right. Mostly because of my conclusions related to this, probably, but consciousness is just such an interesting topic, and all right, let's get started on it. So my first slide here is my definition of quantum mysticism, and probably different than what most of us think of when we hear quantum mysticism. Oh, you know, quantum Fruit Loopery, quantum bunk, you know, quantum nonsense. But I think it needs to be recognized for one particular thing, and that's that it does, by definition, attempt to account for what culture considers mystical phenomenon in a scientific way. Now, the science might be completely wrong. That's not the point, but the point is the method of thinking. Right? I'll give you an example. If someone says to you, I can prove there's an afterlife using quantum mechanics, and let's say you're an atheist and you say, well, no, I'm sorry, I reject supernatural claims, you know, I'm a critical thinker. Well, you've made a category error in that way, because the mystic in this case was trying to explain why it's not supernatural. Even if his explanation is wrong, that's not the point. The point is, it's different than, let's say, a Christian's response or any, you know, religious person's response that would say, we just have a soul, and it's not going to be explained by science, completely separate from, you know, what we see in the brain. So consciousness, you can decide if that's quantum mysticism or not, but it is an attempt to account for consciousness in a scientific way. And even if the implications of it are mystical, it's not the same as invoking a supernatural explanation, and it would not be fair to reject the idea of quantum consciousness on the basis that implications might fall under the same category as what culture considers supernatural. Why you should care? Now, I'm not even a philosophy major or a psychology major, and I'm saying this is going to be one of the biggest deals of mankind. Basically because consciousness equals our existence. And that's going to have implications as, you know, we look into artificial intelligence, as we look into, you know, anti-aging technology, things like that. The puzzles related to consciousness, basically the main one, known as Palmer's hard problem, is why is it that matter and electrical impulses should give rise to this new phenomenon known as subjectivity. There's also my personal favorite, brain-splitting philosophical thought experiment. If I were to take my brain and somehow clone it, which one would my center of awareness go into? These puzzles, I think, present big problems for the idea that consciousness just simply emerges out of smaller properties in the same way that you would see like a snowflake emerge out of the properties of water. Now, it might be true. You know, I'm not opposed to that idea necessarily, but there are people who just say, oh, it's an easy answer, it's just emergence. And I'm saying, well, no, there are many things that need to be explained if we want the full picture of what consciousness is and its place in the universe. Now, here's where there probably will be some philosophical disagreement, but this is, you know, and I'm open to debate on this, but I'm saying that this, you can deduce from that if consciousness is not emergent, then it is in some ways irreducible. And I listed a couple characters there, fundamental properties of the universe, that, well, yeah, fundamental in the sense that, like, mass, for instance, you can quantitatively reduce mass, but the character of mass itself is not reducible in the same way that something like velocity is, which is a quotient of distance and time. And my justification for looking into the quantum realm for answers to consciousness is that basically if it is something that can be comparable to what we know makes up the fabric of reality, that would point in the quantum direction. Not that that's huge evidence that we should stop looking classically, but I think anyway that that at least justifies some research into quantum consciousness. I'm going to focus mostly on these two scientists here. Does anyone know who these are? Stuart Hameroff, Dean Radin?
I know Hameroff.
You know Hameroff? Okay. Basically, Radin, he's a parapsychologist. Hameroff is an anesthesiologist. Getting into Hameroff first. He developed a quantum consciousness model with Roger Penrose. Does everyone know who Roger Penrose is? One of the advisors of Stephen Hawking, actually. Basically, together, they formulated something called the orchestrated objective reduction. This isn't going to be my focus, so I'm going to just run through this really briefly. But essentially, the argument is that microtubules, which are tiny parts inside the axons of neurons, can be in superposition, meaning open and closed at the same time. And they essentially, the amount of the microtubules in superposition increases and then reaches an objective threshold and collapses. This does sound like a bunch of, hocus pocus, but if you watch his talks, if you read his papers, the biology is in there, like the biological arguments for this. I just wanted to present like a theoretical framework. And there is a growing field known as quantum biology, and it's gaining recognition. So it would not be true to say that quantum processes are entirely irrelevant for all biological processes. Again, I'll give you guys some places to go with further research into this at the end. I don't like just asserting things, but for the interest of time, I want to get to the more interesting things. All right. Dean Radin. He did an experiment. Actually, he's done many experiments on this, but I want to present one of these. We talked a lot about in class. Basically, actually, the main focus of our class was, the wave function and uncertainty, and how when you take an observation or a measurement, you collapse the wave function. The question is it a mental kind of observation that collapses it, or could that just be any kind of measurement device that will collapse the wave function? Well, the standard story in physics is that it's just any kind of measurement device. But Radin's getting clever here and trying to test this. So what he did was he had subjects sit on the opposite side of a room of a double-slit apparatus. He would encourage the subjects to, during certain periods, it was actually alternating periods of putting their attention towards the double slit and then taking their attention away. And when they put their attention towards the double slit, the objective would be to try to interact with photons and imagine them passing through the slits and try to affect the ratio of a wave pattern to a double slit pattern. So that would be the hypothesis, is that quantum, some direct function that consciousness has in wave function collapse would cause that ratio to change.
Now, is that word that you have there, it looks like mediators, is it meant to be meditators?
Yes, meditators.
Okay.
Okay, a little spelling issue there.
Quantum T.
Yeah, meditate, yes. Okay.
And why will meditators perform better? Why is that part
That
of
was
Yeah,
presumably
all right, so
his guess.
Right, that was his guess. Now, this is what the thing you have to understand. Now, I'm open to a psychic type of research like this, but even to me, this idea at first sounded ridiculous. that, like really total Fruit Loopery. Like, how on earth would that work? But meditators actually feel that they can move their mind to another location and interact with objects. So you have to at least understand where the hypothesis is coming from.
Now, I'm a little unsure what this increasing interference to wave ratio means. I mean, one thing it might have meant is that if the meditators really pay close attention to this apparatus, then the interference pattern associated with the two slits will disappear. Is that what you mean?
Not disappear entirely, but the ratio over time would become more of a wave pattern. So in other words, like, it's not either an interference pattern or a wave pattern, but it's some ratio of an interference over wave pattern.
Okay, I think I know what you're talking about.
Okay, yeah, I'll present a link at the end for where you can get this book. And also another important thing that's going to be important later is that they were watching. They were able to get live feedback of the ratio. They could literally see, like on a screen, how they were doing. So the overall p-score of this experiment, 6 times 10 to the minus 6, which is very high odds against chance. This might sound like a subjective number, to those of you not familiar with p-scores, but there are very rigorous ways of calculating this based on the experimental and control means. And it's a basic thing you have to do for any experiment you publish. Now, it does not account for things like researcher bias or not tight enough controls. All right? This is just simply taking the variation in the two groups into account and computing the probability against chance. So where am I? But anyway, I'll present the paper at the end, and you can read it and form your opinion on if you think the controls are tight enough or not. Okay. So basically, Spectre here. This is. I know we're not supposed to use in-class readings, but this whole other, this whole topic is based on stuff that we didn't do in class. I'm pulling this one in. This is Spectre's quote, basically defending the standard story of physics. Now, so I wanted to specifically ask Dean Radin what, like I mentioned before, why I would think that the quantum realm may be a place to look for consciousness, but I wanted to ask him, what is it specifically in wave function collapse that you would expect? Let me find the... So he basically goes on to say the standard story in physics is based on the assumption that subjectivity does not interact with objectivity at all, other than when we translate our thoughts into conventional forms of action. I pondered on this for a while, and I couldn't quite get what he was saying. He goes on later to say that other physicists have also said that this could be more of a mental phenomenon than a simple device causing a collapse. So that could be some things I could look into in the future. Is what kind of connections, if any, they have to physics or to what the modern research is indicating. Not in this talk, though. So as I said, the experiment I was showing before, there are actually 6 subset experiments testing slightly different things of how this would work. And in one of them, there was a retrocausal version designed where the slit would record before the subjects would view it. And the subjects didn't know that. It still yielded a significant result, not as high. But this specific I found this specific test interesting, that they're testing, okay, does it even matter what point in time we run the slit experiment, and record it? Could there essentially be reverse time effects or something of that nature, or not necessarily reverse time. It's more of a testing directly the idea that it's the observation, I think, in this case. Now, I want to point out that I'm not saying that these experiments prove quantum consciousness or prove that consciousness does, in fact, cause a collapse. That's not what I'm saying. This is one test, and it needs a lot of replication before we can jump onto this, right? I just want to make my position clear on that, so that you're not all thinking that I'm some sociopath like the guy trying to sell quantum jumping. Yeah. So. The arrow of causality, I think, between Radin and what Hameroff is testing, I noticed that they appear to be different. So Radin is testing if consciousness has any role in the wave function collapse with observations as a mental phenomenon, and Hameroff is testing if microtubules undergo a wave function collapse and generate consciousness. So the arrow of causality appears to be different here. So I asked him, and he basically says, no, these are two different things. Hameroff studying how consciousness gets here, and I'm studying what happens once it arrived. But I just found it interesting that they both involve wave function, and they seem to be two different ideas. How am I doing on time?
Yeah, 14 minutes.
So 14 out of 15, maybe? Okay.
So, wrap it up or no?
Well, you've been going for how much? About
14 minutes. That's what he said.
No, until the end of class.
Oh, 14 minutes left in class.
Yeah.
All right.
You've been going on for a while.
Yeah.
All right.
So the
Why
question
don't you
is...
wrap it up?
I'll wrap it
and
up.
then
Okay.
Then we'll do one more.
Okay. So my take-home points are, I had to skip over the backwards time effects thing, but it's in. I'll provide links. My take-home points: 3 things. First of all, yes, it's justifiable to look and in the quantum realm for answers to consciousness. Justifiable. And we're starting to form a theoretical basis where preliminary results of them indicate that we should continue to look and not completely say quantum consciousness equals bunk. Right? That's my first point. Second point is that how monumentally important it is to get this answer right, and we should not shut down certain ideas even if they go completely against the grain, because we don't want to miss it. We don't want to miss the actual answer. And even if these experiments are they just seem so scientifically implausible, the odds against chance need to be taken into account. And that brings me to my last point. This research is obviously met with a tremendous amount of skepticism, and especially if we start talking about does this imply that there's ESP and all kinds of stuff like that. And that's fine. I think these ideas should be met with skepticism. The main motto of the skeptical movement, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, I actually like that. But the only thing I think that we need, or skeptics need to really take away from this, is that you have to justify what you're considering an extraordinary claim with some kind of statements, as in, okay, this is an extraordinary claim and needs extraordinary evidence because this claim violates X, Y, and Z, not just because this claim just sounds bizarre or just sounds insane. All right, here are a couple things you can check out if you're interested. All right, challenge me. Ask me a question. Yeah.
Wouldn't the theory about wave function collapse in the microtubules imply that anything with neurons has consciousness?
Yeah, I think he actually calculated a certain. Yeah, I recommend you watch that talk. Yeah, in some ways he actually has a mathematical definition of consciousness. It's I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it has something with Planck's constant over. It was based on Planck's constant and some other thing that had to do with the amount of neurons, and you can calculate how much time it would take to reach the objective threshold and collapse. And something with only a couple neurons, he calculated, would take like billions of years, and it would be a very shallow experience. But where you have something like, I think he calculated the threshold to be like 300 neurons would be the minimum threshold for consciousness. I recommend you watch the talk. He goes into that a lot.
Who peer-reviewed the paper?
You peer-reviewed it?
Is it peer-reviewed?
Yes, it's peer-reviewed.
And what was the public? Where is it published?
I can pull it up. Yeah, that's a good question. Where's... Yeah, I think it's Physics Essays is the name of the... Okay. Right here. So yes, this is peer reviewed. The information is here. Yeah, Physics Essays. That's the journal. It wasn't well liked, as you can imagine, but it's peer reviewed. This isn't just something that he put on his website. Yeah.
But if what he says is true, then a precondition to have consciousness is neurons, correct?
Hameroff, right?
Yes.
Keep him. This is Radin that I talked about too.
Yeah. Now, when an organism dies, obviously neurons, everything dies.
Mm-hmm.
What's your opinion on consciousness? What happens after? Does consciousness cease to exist, or does it disperse through space and time? Because there's a lot of theories out there that when you die, your consciousness returns to the universe.
What's my opinion?
Yeah, what's your opinion? Your opinion.
I think it's a tough question. I think that the idea of quantum mechanics definitely makes it more plausible in some senses than the idea that it just emerges from neurons because of the scale it's on, and if it's some fundamental property. I think you could make a respectable case for consciousness without a brain.
Mm-hmm.
A respectable case. I'm not saying that it's something we have proof of or anything like that, but I think you could build a plausibility argument based on that.
Let me make a small technical criticism. You said, if I remember right, that a number of quantities, such as mass, are sort of irreducible.
Yeah, this is where I wanted your feedback.
Irreducible. And you said velocity is reducible because velocity is a ratio of distance over time.
Right, which are two smaller.
But mass is a ratio of momentum to velocity.
Okay.
So
that's how you calculate it, or so can.
Well, as a matter of fact, if you come back to Isaac Newton, who is not totally outdated despite the appearance of quantum mechanics, then he defined momentum. He used an operational definition for mass by saying a quantity which is conserved, namely momentum, is equal to the product of mass and velocity. So you divide both sides of that equation by velocity and you get momentum over velocity equals mass. So therefore, it's very tricky to talk about some quantity and say it is or is not reducible because you can or cannot make it a ratio of other things. In essence, you always can make it a ratio of other things.
Okay, so I think that's where the philosophy comes in, is what do you define as a character that, even if, I guess if you can define it as a ratio of other things, maybe that doesn't mean that it's not an irreducible character in some sense. But
well, that's possible, but in that sense you could say the same thing about velocity.
Right, that's true. Yeah, velocity might have been a bad example.
Okay.
But
Anyway,
but yeah,
that's the end of my little
Okay.
excursion.
I'm glad I got your feedback there. That was where I was looking for it. Yeah, Sam,
Okay, so
I make you angry enough?
no, I'm not discrediting
Okay.
anything. Not yet. No.
It's fine. You can discredit me. Yeah,
So no, my main question was, is there a distinction in this paper between the subject doing the directing of their consciousness being self-aware as well? Because I mean, there are a lot of things that have neurons, but human consciousness is really unique. So how exactly is he defining consciousness? Does self-awareness come into play? Is this something that only happens in humans? Like what exactly?
I would say mostly even self-awareness is tricky how you define it. Do you mean like aware of yourself or just aware of anything?
Like, no, not aware of anything, because that would be like
Okay.
my definition for
So you're talking about
consciousness.
complex consciousness. Yeah,
Right,
I think that would depend on having a sufficiently complex system. But I think you could still have an awareness there without necessarily such a complicated state of it. Like I'm aware of this and I'm aware of all these things. Yeah, that I think you can describe as emergence, for sure. I mean, we have very good evidence for that based on how organisms evolve and what we know they're aware of. So yeah, that's actually an important distinction. I think that's extended consciousness, basically everything that encircles consciousness, everything attached to it, that does, in fact, could be described as emergence that you only get with higher and higher complexity in brains.
So do you think he would say that directing your consciousness is something that just humans are capable of, or other organisms?
Maybe just humans. I don't know what he would say.
I just thought it was like kind of interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Just
Steve.
there were two things. There's this paper, and what was the other thing you cited? I slipped out of my brain.
The other thing
There was a YouTube. There we go.
Yeah, you can.
That's all I need.
Okay.
And the other thing was the distinction made, like it said neurons are a precondition for consciousness, right? But if you have a person who is unconscious, who has been rendered unconscious, their neurons are still firing, right? Does it say anything in that regard? Is there a distinction between the two? Can you have neurons are a precondition for consciousness, but
I'd be careful with saying neurons are a precursor of consciousness. Actually, Hameroff talks about how it's more of the fundamental. I don't want to get all Deepak Chopra here, but he talks about how the Planck scale features are more of a precursor to consciousness. And neurons, essentially, his argument is that the neurons access it rather than necessarily produce it. They access it from something that's been there. But now, let me address that other thing you were talking about, putting a patient to sleep, anesthesia or something like that. He's an anesthesiologist. He talks about that too, and how yes, under anesthesia, a brain is still almost as active as it is while it's awake, but the difference is that consciousness isn't there, or at least it's not, connected to the senses. So he says that's a distinction, and from that come a whole bunch of testable predictions. That was actually the other point I wanted to make, is that after I said, after I presented this crazy double slit experiment that Dean did, I wanted to, my point of that was not that it proves anything, but that quantum consciousness has testable predictions. That was my point.
Well, I don't even know whether it means it has to be quantum. Suppose it were definitively shown that that something about quantum about consciousness influence the results of double slit experiments.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's another way I could do it, which nobody would call quantum. I put my finger over one of the slits.
Okay.
And that certainly does remove the pattern. So to say that consciousness influences the pattern does not necessarily mean that there's anything yes or no quantum about consciousness.
Yeah, true, but I mean, I would say he tested it a little more directly than, or said another way, I think his controls were a little tighter than that. I mean, I think we know that he didn't, you're right, but I think it's, there are probably a finite number of things you could think of that are,
or to put it another way, coming back to these people, meditators or not, focusing their attention on the two slits. I don't think there would be any statement that a meditator said, I know it went through the right slit, or I know it went through the left slit. From what you've described, it was just they were paying attention to the slits, and there was some reduction in the two-slit interference intensity as a result. Well, I want to look at that very, very carefully.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, you can
Thank
look
you.
at the paper.
Okay. Good.